Sup nerds? Uncle here bringing you a patch review of hotfix 622. This one was really a banger for multiplayer. Just an incredible number of good fixes by CA. A lot of this was a result of a community feedback sourcing effort driven by Catholic Alcoholic and CA listening, so credit to CA. Let's jump right into the changes. So the first is a cross-cutting change that's really cool. For Domination game mode, now all of these elite infantry have 7 instead of 5 capture weight. This opens up more flexibility for what can work in the game because instead of having these expensive units that trade well, using them carefully and effectively in the matchup, and then just getting overwhelmed on the point, now you've got a little more oomph in the late game if you have these expensive units sitting around. So, love this change. Should open up some more strategies, and we should see some really cool units. And it's cross-cutting. It affects basically all the high-end infantry in the game. Moving on, another cross-cutting change. This one's just great for multiplayer and campaign. So before there was this stat knockback resistance, and what would happen is you would hit a foot character, and they would just ignore the damage. So this could lead to really janky situations where like casters or foot heroes were effectively invincible from higher mass units. CA has raised the minimum for units to ignore this to 40%. Meaning that a lot more units are going to be getting hit by dinosaurs, cav, chariots, etc., than were previously getting hit. And also now performance should look more like the stat cards than what you would expect when you're looking at these units in the game. So overall, great change. Really happy to see it. Should make it more fun to play, less surprising, less frustrating. Moving on to the balance changes. Again, like across the board, these changes were pretty good. So the Beastmen as a whole got some buffs to their underplayed and unplayed lords. You love to see it. And this is going to be a theme of this patch. CA got around to giving just a little more oomph to a bunch of melee lords. And diversity is key. It lets you be creative and experiment in what builds you build. And this is really good for that. Malagor, who is kind of like an auto take and is still going to be fine. Auto take in a lot of matchups. People did take other lords. Got a nerf. The casters got nerfs. Not huge nerfs, just like a little slap on the wrist. So I love seeing like the best thing getting nerfed a little bit and the things that you can't play being buffed. And then we saw just like some small balance adjustments to other parts of the roster. So like Cockatrice, previously unplayable, got a nice buff. On large units, this stat is a good one to have because it lets them dive more efficiently without getting peeled, and it lets them duel other large SEs better. Zangor's small buff, fine. None of these buffs and nerfs are too consequential. Like Goreherd, where the 625 dual weapons just like a little bit above curve. Good to see them like brought down a notch. And also Chaos Spawn got a not inconsiderable buff. Like this is a good amount of stats improvements. And they just had kind of slipped out of playable from power creep. So it's very cool to see a classic unit that's very iconic get a buff. And then the Man Ripper is like small buff. Overall, not massive changes on the Beastmen. Good adjustments to units that were over or under tuned. For Bretonia across the board, the ward save is now cheaper, which is pretty cool. Big buff. It's going to impact a lot of units. Similarly, we got like small buffs to some melee lords that were a bit below the power curve, as well as the caster lord. So that's a bit of a nice gold increase for Bret. Battle Pilgrims were like basically unplayable. They couldn't trade well against anything. They got a small buff and shield, so now at least they can perhaps be a role player pushing into some ranged factions, but overall probably still pretty weak. The Foot Squire buff is real, like this unit would get played before, so they got small cost reduction and then it increased to leadership, MA, and MD. This unit's going to duel pretty well against most armored middle tier infantry now. Exciting to see that. More options opening up. The Trebs got a small buff. These units were already kind of niche, so this should push them into like playable, but not like as a large frequent unit. And then this is one of the biggest buffs in the patch. Knights of the Realm got a huge buff. They got 10 armor, 2 more base weapon damage, and 1 more AP. This is already like one of the better cavalry units in the game, so very cool to see Bret having a standout. Bret was kind of in the bottom 5 or 6 factions in Domination, so it's nice to see them get buffed, and I think they're going to play a lot better now. And then rounding it out, small buffs to the rest of the cav. On the Chorf side, we saw some of the most OP things that were causing Chorfs to be really narrow get nerfs. So Bale Taurus, it's not here, but in the abilities, the heal on their Caster Lord got a nerf to only proc. So they had a whenever you cast a spell globally, their Caster Lord would heal, which was just like broken in half. Now it has a limited proc range, and then they buffed up some of the units that were seeing less viable play, like Kadai Fireborn, the Destroyer, their RAR, just a lot of stuff. The ranged Iron Daemon train got a small nerf, and the melee Skullcracker got a small buff. So overall, just like pretty reasonable changes. And I'm excited to give these a try and see how they do, but nothing crazy on Chorfs. For Doc, they got just a buff to Be'lakor, but a lot of small changes like buffs to Horrors, Unleashed, and other things. Overall, not the most consequential. The biggest thing in this patch, actually, for Doc was a huge nerf in the form of the Lore of Light global passive now giving magic attacks. And so for factions that can bring a Lore of Light caster, they've now got this massive threat against Doc where they can do that and then get the ability to ignore Fizz across the roster. The Dark Elf changes were pretty large. These were one of the only ones I didn't love, mostly because their Cav got a pretty large cost increase, 50 gold. They were good Cav, but they were also one of the standout things making Dark Elves viable. And the Dark Elves were already kind of like a C, B tier faction. Not great, but an effective role player. They got buffs to a lot of things, like Chariots in melee and turning, but they got range damage nerfs to Scourge Runners, and they got a significant cost increase to Cold One Knights, which were a 4 of in most of their builds. So overall, I think this is a net nerf to the Dark Elves, which should push them down into like low C, high D tier. The one thing is the Lore of Dark spells got some buffs, especially Doombolt. So we'll have to look into that when we get to the spell section. But on balance, I think this was one of the few misses in the patch. The Dark Elves overall got nerfed and were already not in like the best spot. But there's at least some compensation for it. There's like interesting new play patterns with Chariots that this helps unlock. Dwarves, relatively inconsequential changes, like small buffs to some units. Thoric already was like not the best lord. People complained about him, but so he's nerfed. Now shouldn't be the most playable, but it's not a huge change to the faction overall, because if you were playing like an optimal build, you weren't bringing Thoric that much anyways. Moving on to the Empire. Empire were a strong faction, like kind of high A, low S tier. They got some units that we're not seeing the most play, like Archlector and Volkmar buffed. Very cool. Buffs to heroes. Nerf to the Engineer, which was a little bit overpowered. And then small buffs to some more units that were like well below the stat curve, like Flagellants, Ironsides, Mortars. None of these are too consequential. So just like taking units that were less viable and bringing them more in line with other stuff so that we can try them out. For example, Hellblasters now should serve a better role taking out Cav and Infantry. But overall, Emp should stay about where it is. Moving on to GC. GC is kind of the bottom of the barrel. They're like one of the weakest factions, if not the weakest. In this patch, they mostly got buffs, but the buffs are not enough to pull them back up. So kind of cool to see some of these heroes and less played monsters get better. The biggest change is the 25 gold cost reduction on Jade Warriors, and the buffs to Celestial Dragon Crossbows and Dragon Guard. So this will help Grand Cathay out, but they're still not quite there. The Grenadiers kind of have janky animations, so they can do well. Like these are short-ranged grenade infantry. Overall, like good changes, increase the balance, but don't fix GC. They probably need like a little bit more chaff efficiency to find their way into like B or C tier. Moving on to the Greenskins, we have a whole lot of changes on the Greenskins. So a bunch of the melee lords and their mounts that were less good got buffs. Great to see it. Snagla, the hero, he's got a lot of kits like a net and a summon, and a damage spell got a buff. The overpowered Ruglets got a small nerf, which is perfectly reasonable, but this should bring them more in line while still being viable. Night Goblins, a small buff. Probably still not a unit that you're going to see very much, but it doesn't hurt to like, increase their punching power just a little bit. Similarly, the Night Goblin Archers were like fine, but not the best. They got a small AP damage increase, which you like to see. And the Rusty Errors got another similar change. Basically, like all the Night Goblins got like a very, very small shift to AP damage. The Pump Flappas got a nerf. This is 700. They're still probably like a pretty good unit. These were one of the more strong things on the roster. So this is like a meaningful nerf because a lot of Greenskins builds took 1 to 4 of these. But across the board, they're getting a lot more flexibility with small buffs to things like the rock lavas and a bunch of their other support units. So I think it's about even for greenskins, except for a buff to one of my favorite units. I love the Arachnarok Lord, and it was like totally unplayable before because it had this like really, really, really low hit ignore chance. And so it would just get like stun locked by other SEs or even like high damage halberds in some scenarios. They moved this up to be like pretty good at ignoring hits. So now Arachnaroks are a good SE duelist, and the Lord can be used more mobily. So this is actually a reasonably large buff to the greenskins, because before they didn't have like a super effective, cost-efficient Terror Lord, and they gave mass both to the Wyvern Lords as well as fixing an issue where just the Arachnarok had like a different stat in this category than basically anything else in the unit. I think this got set in like Warhammer 1 and just never touched, so really cool to see CA fixing like a very, very, very old defect. Moving on to the High Elves, buffs to Tyrion, he wasn't very good. Now he's still not the best, but, you know, a little bit more play. Alethanar got a meaningful buff. The Moonbow hits pretty hard now, so his active can hone in on targets, making him like, you know, a borderline viable Lord, which is exciting. We were just trying it out yesterday a little bit. Lore Master's buffed. Overall, like the most meaningful things here are just the Sisters going up. The unit wasn't really playable before. 1050 should get it a bit closer. And then by far the White Lion buff. High Elves had this problem where like middle tier armored infantry was somewhat difficult for them to address. And part of it was that the White Lions would just die to like a stiff breeze. Giving them 5 additional hit points is a meaningful amount of additional tankiness, and they should perform a lot better now as a result. And then a lot of the High Elf Heavy and Elite Cav got this acceleration bonus. Relatively small change, but overall like nice bringing up of things on the High Elf roster that needed a little bit of an assist, because the High Elves were very much like a C, B- faction. Moving on to Khorne, small buff to Relentless Rage. Probably still, this is the one that makes their units, it's Army 2, it's the one that makes their units unkillable for duration. You're probably going to see the other abilities, Sword of Khorne, you know, the big AoE and the attack buff getting more use. Valkia was taken too many times, was like a bit more efficient than a lot of things. So is Skull Taker, which pushed out all the other Lords. So I like this small nerf to these units. You know, they're still viable, they still work, but should be a little less like auto-include. And then they buffed up Arbol a little bit. He was unplayable before. You really have to do a lot to be like mostly a melee-only Lord. Similarly, the Blood Speaker got a significant buff. You like to see it. This was a trend across the board. I love this piece of the patch. And then, you know, just some other support units like the Khorne Chariots, Blood Crushers got buffs. Nothing too crazy or impactful, but overall a net buff to the faction, I think. Or about flat. You know, like you were taking one of the 2 Lords they nerfed, but the nerfs to those were pretty small, and they got some nice stat tune-ups to supporting units. Moving on to Kislev. It's not listed here, but one of the larger changes in the patch was that they nerfed Patriarch heal. So now instead of being able to clown car your entire army of like 30 units onto the damn Patriarch and just healing for like 4k value, you can hit at most 4, which is consistent with other AoE heals. And I was really excited to see that. And then to help compensate for that, they buffed a lot of the unplayable units like Boris, the Night Watchman. Oh, that's interesting. So dual weapons typically have like about a certain charge, and these guys didn't have it. The Great Weapon Armored Kossars getting buffed is meaningful. So now Kislev can consider builds that take a lot of Kossars. A nice resiliency buff to the Ice Guard. So for these ranged units, you know, they're like an elite ranged unit. They really want to not be easy to kill with spells. And this kind of buff helps that. Otherwise, you take this expensive thing and it just gets winded or something. And then some other small buffs. So the most important thing is this patch, well, also a nerf to the Frost nerfs, basically nerfed the Patriarch Frost nerf blob, which was like a really degenerate strategy that was pushing some people away from multiplayer, and gave some like not the most consequential but helpful buffs to help compensate. So overall, nerf to Kislev, which was like, you know, high A tier, and that feels about right. I think this was a good change. Common theme of this patch is that CA basically hit the mark. Moving on to the Lizardmen, basically all the melee lords got buffed. Very cool. Love to see it. I'll avoid like re-summarizing all of that since you guys kind of get the idea. Small buff to the Skink Chiefs. My beloved Saurus Warriors. I've been a Lizard main on and off, and these guys had really fallen by the wayside with some adjustments and buffs to Cav. This won't completely fix it, but it really puts them more in line with other infantry. And because for middle tier infantry they had kind of low MA, this buff is larger than it looks. So like 3 MA matters a lot when you're going from like not hitting very much to hitting more. Because as a percentage, it represents a pretty large chunk. You know, this can be like a 10 to 20% DPS buff for the source against a lot of targets. So meaningful buff to a unit that really needed it. Love to see it. Sacred Crocs were a similar unit. You know, they had like some niche applications against demons. But just like a bit of a stat tune-up to make them more of a viable playable unit. Similar thing with Carnosaurs. You didn't see them too much. The Feral Stegodon I like. It also didn't get that much play, but it was like almost there. So taking 100 off, plus making foot characters no longer immune to all the knockback these kinds of dinos do, probably gives it a pretty solid role for taking out foot characters like Wight Kings. I'll have to play with this, but overall good change again to the Lizards. Some of these neutral character buffs, totally fine. None of these were really seeing that much play, so Ulrika and Gotrek getting small buffs helps open up the game. For Norska, quite a few changes. So small adjustments to a bunch of the characters, like bringing Wulfric more in line with other Mammoth, increasing the mass of the horse characters. This is actually a pretty meaningful one because Wulfric would get stuck and die a lot, and a lot of Norska builds are taking him on his horse. The Balefiend attack buff is very cool. It's a good unit before, actually, so now it should be pretty good. It can kind of double up as like a hybrid melee caster, and giving it a little more MA makes it more lethal in that role. Chaff buffs are always a big deal. A lot of Norska builds would take a couple of these, and they were a little bit below the efficiency curve of other units, so you like to see that. Norska was like a B tier to A tier faction, like basically balanced, maybe slightly on the strong side. This unit didn't get any play. It's the raw Marauder, so totally fine to have a small buff. The Berserkers were completely unplayable before. I did a few tests with them just now, and they don't seem to be incredible, but they're solid now. Basically, they fixed like a janky animation with them, so they perform better without stat changes. Marauder Champ Great Weapon similarly was not a unit that saw much play, so don't mind taking 100 off it, should open up options. They nerfed the Ice Wolf Chariots, which is good. This unit was overpowered. It still is very good. And you like to see that, so like things that are unplayable getting buffed, things that are OP getting nerfed. Similarly, throwing axes were like a little bit below the curve, as were trolls. As were Famir, so they get like some nice quality of living buffs to help round out their roster. Same thing with Feral Mammoth. And then they nerfed the OP War Shrine. So basically, Chariots and War Shrines got nerfed, which were kind of overpowered, and a bunch of other stuff that had marginal or niche play got buffed. So I think in net, this is probably a small nerf to Norska, but it's an increase to the ability to build different rosters and run diverse threats and plans. So overall should be an increase to fun, and you know, might be like net buff or flat, like pretty good balance change for an already balanced faction. Moving on to Nurgle. They buffed the slow, very cool to see. It was a little underpowered before, so you would kind of just wait for Fecundity and spam Fecundity. That's their heal. The spread radius of 50 meters means now it can actually hit multiple units. This gives some cool tactical options. I like that change. Nurgle also really needed some help. It was kind of on the underpowered side. The Rotfly hero mounts got a buff, which is nice. You didn't really see them that much. They weren't very good, easily stuck. The Rotflies got a huge buff, so they should be a lot chunkier on the charge now, and be able to actually act as like a mobile melee unit. And similarly, this mass helps them get out, and just really everything they're trying to do, it's harder to stop them from getting where they're trying to go now. So you love to see that. They're like a pretty cool, interesting unit, and Nurgle really needed some mobile tools that were playable. Looking forward to playing with these and seeing like how they are after the buff. So across the board that happened. Pox Riders got a cost reduction, which is totally fine, and an MA increase. They were pretty weak before, so I think this is a good change. Barons of the Bog were actually playable, like you take them on dock sometimes. So with a bit more MA, this starts to become like not just playable, but good. And they got the spawn treatment. I'll have to try out the spawn and see how they do. This looks like maybe enough to make the spawn viable. That's 5 charge bonus. And some additional attack damage is nothing to sneeze at, but they were pretty weak before, so we'll see. I'd love to see these Beast of Nurgle changes. It's not listed here, but they also buffed the AoE. This is like the individual slime blob guy. He actually could like take a unit of Forsaken before, and they made him faster. So I think this unit might work. I'm gonna play it. You can take a lot of them. It's a pretty fun unit. Basically, it's got like this AOE MA reduction, and it's got like reasonably chunky stats. It would kind of help if it had terror or some other utility though. The great unclean one was stone unplayable. Got 100 gold cost reduction and now gets 2 streams. It might be starting to get there. It's slow, but it's like one of the chunkier melee duelists in the game. Uncle for Uncle might actually work. This is a big cost reduction and more streams. Means that he's one of the better SE duelists that you can purchase in the game right now. You need to find an application where they can't just kite him to shit. So probably in melee matchups against like Slaneesh or Khorne for Nurgle, this kind of thing has some potential fringe applications. And the Toe Dragon got a higher hit reaction ignore, so it's going to get staggered and just sit there dirtling less. So overall, buffs to Nurgle, probably not enough to bring them in line with other top factions. So they're probably still like kind of D or C, but this helps move them out of the Cathay and Nurgle tier. Moving on to Ogre Kingdoms. Ogre was like solidly, a top 3 or 4 faction, very overpowered before. They meaningfully decreased the army charge ability rate, as well as the Ogre's top end heal. So great to see those 2 nerfs. Probably not enough overall still, but we'll see. They updated Greasus to have like a better profile. And also, so like you don't pay for Horde Master, and now he has an on hit. So he didn't really work very well before. It'll be interesting to try him out and see if it works. Bret got a nice buff. Like basically their melee heroes got buffed, which I think was a good change. Hunter Stonehorns got nerfed. It's fine. They were like not the best, but people took them a lot. Pigback Rar got nerfed, which is a very good idea. The unit was like completely busted. It's still playable. People will take it and it'll do well. The biggest change in this was reducing the missile pen of Belchers. This is a pretty significant nerf to the unit. Front side, they usually were going to only hit like 3 or 4 models, but on side hits, they were doing exceptionally well. And this reduces the overall ability of this unit to dominate a game quite as quickly. I think it's a good balance change, and there's still going to be like a playable unit. Like a lot of builds were taking 1 Belcher. Crusher's Iron Fist just never got played, so small cost decrease, not consequential, but helps increase diversity. Same thing with Mournfang Cav. Nerfing the Harpoon Launcher, unit wasn't the best, but it's fine. Ogres was overpowered as a whole. Similarly, like the Snowhorns makes sense, and then the Thunder Tusk was completely OP, and so this change probably makes it a bit weaker, but it's still going to be good. So overall, like meaningful nerf to the Ogres. They're probably still going to be like high A tier, but perhaps no longer just like this ultra dominant S tier presence that suppresses a lot of otherwise interesting factions out of the meta. On the Skaven side, buffs to unplayable melee lords. Love to see it. Nothing more to say there. The Eshin Sorcerer was already kind of fringe playable, so buff there is nice. Similarly, the Plague Priest really needed it. It just kind of didn't work and was too pricey. Gorich is maybe the most interesting, where this unit actually did have some applications and now has a significant cost decrease. So it'll be fun to see that. And Brood Horror got the Scurry Away stat increase, as well as a cost decrease, which I think is pretty cool. Same thing with Warp Grinders. This is like the melee unit that nets. They were so squishy that they couldn't really be used. They got a nice little HP bonus, so maybe more doable now. Nerf to Globadiers, which makes sense. Skaven was kind of C tier, like they work, but they're not good. They can counter certain things. This was one of the better units on the roster. So like an 8 or 9% nerf to help offset some of the other buffs is not unreasonable. The Warpfire Throwers didn't see a ton of play. Small buff might make them playable, maybe not. And then a nerf to the Avalanche Mortars, which were like a solid unit and could be kind of oppressive in some circumstances. So overall, it looks like maybe a small buff to Skaven. Like most of the time, their Lord and Hero Kit is going to get a cost reduction. And unless you were bringing like a whole lot of globes, you're not seeing much of a nerf from that. But it's not a mega buff, so they'll remain like middling. A decrease in the Slaneesh army ability gain rate is great. Slaneesh was definitely high A, low S tier, overpowered. Nothing more to say about that. And then they buffed a bunch of unplayable Slaneesh units like Spawn, Grinders, Cultists, the Keeper, and the Marquis of Masochism. So overall, good buffs. And then they nerfed Pavane of Slaneesh into Oblivion, which was taken in almost all Slaneesh builds and was one of the reasons the faction was OP. So overall, this is like a meaningful nerf to Slaneesh, but a well-calibrated one. Probably moves them into more like middle A tier, high B tier. Hitting the army ability hits every build, as does Pavane hit, most builds. The Tomb Kings were probably the best faction in the game before, and they didn't really get nerfed too much, so whoops. That's maybe one of the issues with the patch, but they did get nerfed. So, like Cetra mount wasn't playable before, got small buffs, probably still not playable. Cetra on War Sphinx was taken a lot, meaningful nerf to the War Sphinx, so now they're a little more dirtly and less like slippery gooses. All the chariots got buffed. The hero chariots, not a huge deal. They weren't the best. These units aren't playable in multiplayer. The Skelly Chariots got a small missile damage increase, which they were already like a decent role player unit, so that's cool to see. So basically, like Sphinxes got nerfed, Hero Chariots got buffed, and I was actually wrong. This was like a reasonable nerf. And I think when we go down, Usarians also got nerfed, which was one of the better spells, and Screaming Skulls got nerfed. So this is like a slap on the wrist nerf with like a little more impact on the cats. A lot of people like to spam the cats, but the reason Tomb Kings were overpowered was more like their chaff and cav efficiency, and this doesn't do anything to address that. Additionally, because they have a Lore of Light caster, the large buff to the Lore of Light passive is a faction buff for Tomb Kings, where against factions with a lot of fizz resist, like Norska, Skinwolves, and Demons, and all the Monogod Chaos factions, the option to take a light caster and just cleave through that fizz resist is actually a meaningful improvement as an option for the faction. So net, I think Tomb Kings will remain like a powerful S tier faction. Moving on to Tzeentch. Pretty cool updates to Tzeentch. So, some of the mounts, like the discs that didn't see that much play, see small buffs. The Zangars get small buffs. Exalted Pinks never really got played. They get buffed. Doom Knights got some fringe play, actually, and they got a significant buff. Mass and BVL to the regular and the RAR will make them a lot more effective at assassinating a bunch of different targets and playing that like ultra mobile elite flying cav role. Similarly to other factions, the spawn got buffed. The Tzeentch spawn were actually kind of okay, at least the weird spawn. So cool to see that, and we might be seeing them in some more games now, complementing Tzeentch's frontline. The Cockatrice got a nice buff. Aeson, the RAR Mutalith Beast got a buff, probably not OP. The Lord of Change never really got played, so I think a buff is reasonable. And the Golden Griffin did see some play, but it wasn't like a great unit and a small buff. So overall, like a lot of things on the Tzeentch roster that were difficult to use for significant profit, getting buffed. And Tzeentch was like in a place where it needed some help. So I think well-measured good changes to the Tzeentch roster. Moving on to Coast. Arnessa got nerfed, kind of catching some strays. This is a nerf on a foot character because it makes them harder to kill. So this is actually a meaningful nerf, and she was like kind of unplayable already. So whatever. It doesn't actually affect the faction, but it's a bummer. Noctilus got on his Colossus got a nice buff. They actually nerfed meaningfully the Fleet Admiral pistol, which was one of the main lords people would bring. So that does bring the faction down a little bit. But then they buffed the Gunnery Wight. This unit, it looks like it's like on the border of playable now. This is their hero. He's got like a wind bound item, and you can put him on a crab, and he duels pretty well. Will be exciting to try that. Their melee specialist got significant buffs. 150 off the cost, 500 onto the mass should make it perform better. A lot of builds were taking 4 or 5 pole arms, so chaff efficiency is one of the most important things. This will add 50 to 125 extra gold to all these VP builds and helps offset any of the nerfs that you're seeing pretty effectively. This one is a hidden Dom. The Zombie Pirate Gunnery mob was often like a 3 to 5 of, so same comments apply. Those roughly net out. And then the Depth Guard, you would actually play them before. They had a role, but they were just so damn squishy. And getting whatever this is, like a 9% health increase is a meaningful buff. Similarly, like Fell Bats and Scurvy Dogs give them a bit more mobility options. Bloated Corpse is just fun. Sometimes this works. It's such a cool unit. I think 350 is maybe still too much, but it's like starting to get to a price point where you can see it. The Deck Dropper Handgunners also were pretty weak. They're kind of toxic when they work, but 650 is like a safe number. So overall, like some chaff efficiency improvements to the mobility and pikes, and then nerfs to a Common Lord and the pistol summons. I think this is a net buff to the VP, but they were already pretty weak, like D tier, and I don't think this is going to change that. But common to most of the changes in this patch, still pretty well measured, like making smart changes in most places where they make sense. Moving on to counts. Counts is, I think, the only place that CA made a misstep in this patch. They did some really good things. So they took some of the lords like Gorst that were not good and made them better. They made the Wight King worse. This unit was really annoying and really OP. Like it was basically because it has silver shields, lots of health, and is a foot character, and it could get knocked back so easily. It would basically just like never ever die. You could just walk it into any situation, and it could just wait after their range, and it wasn't afraid of monsters or cav or anything. So this brings it a little more in line with like what you would expect and creates less frustrating, like invincible walking zombie situations. So that part of the patch was good. And then they buffed a bunch of the things that like didn't have a ton of play, like the anti-large grave guards, the Banshee hero, Cairn Wraith Cav. Crypt Ghouls were pretty anemic as a Vanguard summon, so you like to see like a, whatever this is, a 10% health increase. Similarly, you know, this Cav was very weak, as were the Blood Knights. You did see a little bit of Direwolf play and Fellbat play. The Fellbat buff is probably the most relevant one, since these were often one or two of. So those like net, these are buffs to VC, except for the Wight King nerf, which is a significant nerf, and most VC builds took 2. But that's not getting into the most significant change to the VC roster, which was the lore passive got its healing potential basically doubled. And this is going to be a problem because VC were like high A, low S, and giving them a strong healing global that is easily spammed is a pretty significant buff to the faction. So my bet is what we're going to see is VC is like one of the best, if not the best factions after this, and has an oppressively strong push. So I think that we're going to need to see some nerfs. Overall, like the changes were well-intentioned and kind of on target for this faction with that one exception. And I think that change is probably the worst change in the patch. Of what is otherwise a very, very good patch. Like basically it took a S tier faction and it made them S'er, which you don't like to see that much. Moving on to Warriors of Chaos. Whole lot of like unplayable Lord buffs. You love to see it. I'm not going to summarize all of these, save y'all some time. The heroes got buffed. There's just like a lot of characters that needed a little bit of love here getting it. Similarly, you know, the Chaos Warriors of Nurgle needed a little bit more. You know, they were like kind of a weak infantry unit, as were the Zinchi and Spears, and we saw buffs to those. A lot of Chaos Warriors and like kind of anemic mono god infantry units getting buffed. So very cool to see. And then similarly across the board, the Lances got buffed, Chaos Knight Lances. These are just a really cool unit, and they were kind of weak before. The other variant is even weaker than the Lances, but so Lances were a lot of what saw play, but you know, one change at a time. Knocking 100 off these puts them like much closer to playability, and I think should open up some better mobility options for this faction that sorely needed it. That is after the Hellstriders got nerfed. And it also like opens up builds where you don't just auto take max marks on Hellstriders, which is more exciting than just always spamming the 1 OP light cav. That said, Walk is still totally going to do that because they got nerfed, but they're still, they're fine. They're fine. Buffed Gorebeast. It's kind of cool to see Chariots working. Similarly, you know, Chaos Trolls buffed, Spawn buffed. Lots of cool units. Should help build out faction diversity. The Wood Elf changes were really solid, I think. Zotes didn't quite work that well. They got like a really meaningful buff, 100 gold, extra use of Flesh to Stone. Hawk Riders probably remain unplayable. They got like some melee improvements. The RAR didn't work. It got buffed. It probably still doesn't work, but step in the right direction. Glade Captain got BVL on the Great Eagle, so may have some fringe applications now, which is cool. Orion, this is a buff. This is a buff. Pew is fine. It's not a huge buff. And the Cave Bats are not a multiplayer unit. The biggest change to the Wood Elves was a significant nerf to Arrows of Kurnus, which was a really OP annoying ability on Waystalkers that could just delete infantry, and they gave it less cleaving, so now it is much weaker. They also buffed the lore passives for 2 of the Wood Elf lores. Lore of Dark now gives a much longer duration of global missile buff to the Wood Elf units, and their high magic fizz resist buff lasts longer as well. So overall, I think this is a net nerf to the Wood Elves because it reduced the efficacy of their most overpowered ability, but the lore passive buffs as well as the improvements to Lore of Dark Doombolt should actually open up some more play options for the faction. So Wood Elves was pretty S tier, maybe A tier before. They were in the like 6 or so really strong factions, and I think they'll remain there, but in a way that is less frustrating because they can't just snipe you from like infinite distance. The one thing is if the dark passive is overpowered, it might push them over the top. There's probably going to be some pretty scary missile spam builds where they get global buffs from that. Moving on to abilities, most of these summons are not that impactful. We already talked about Arrows of Kurnus. Great change. They made it more expensive. They made it cleave infantry less well. Love to see it. It still can function as an anti-arty piece, but is less of like a take it everywhere, dominate everything with it. A lot of these other changes are just like better usability. 35 meters for all these AoE auras is just not enough for them to hit like 2 units, so they don't really perform how you'd expect when you're looking at the ability. Moving up to 55 opens up playability of a lot of them. Ancient's Protection and Wrath of the Wood were the two I was talking about for high and dark magic for just Wood Elves. These are meaningful buffs, like 12 to 15 seconds for global fizz resist matters, as does 15 seconds for Wrath of the Woods, which is their range damage increase. Lore of the Dark on Wood Elves is probably quite good now, actually. And similarly, Toxic Rain, you got buff to the caster that carries this around for Skaven, and also a duration increase. So it's nice to see like different lores of magic getting a little more viability. Most of these AoE things are not like game changing, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about them. Here's Curse of Undeath. This was crazy. This is the VC one. I get that they wanted to increase consistency of stuff, but in a patch doing this, it would have been ideal to nerf in more meaningful ways than hitting the White Kings, the faction that was already really strong. But that's okay. I think at least VC, as a faction that's overpowered, has things that can counter it, like really strong kite or like halberd slash spear builds backed up by high DPS backline ranged. So they're unlikely to be completely degenerate and run over the meta, but they are going to be like strong, pushing, oppressive. Let's keep going. This is the Kislev nerf. Patriarch can no longer heal 10 units at once. Great change. Just looking for this. This is the slimes, the Nurgle SE beast that has an AoE attack reduction. Just a fun ability. I don't think it's going to be that consequential. Smoke and Mirrors buff. This is the Lore of Shadows thing that gives a global speed buff. It's a small quality of living improvement, but that ability was already kind of takeable, and it should help out Lore of Shadows. Foe Seeker across the board, also kind of cool. People didn't take this ability that much. Normally it just reduces vigor. Now it also improves charge speed and does a little more what it says, which is great. Worth noting just because a lot of heroes have this ability. This Exorcism change to Lore of Light is a huge one. So now it lasts longer. Previously it gave ITP and 4 leadership only. Now it also gives magical attacks, and it's actually pretty strong against anything that's packing a bunch of fizz resist. And a lot of factions have incidental fizz resist, so I think we're going to be seeing Lore of Light spam casters a lot more now, pushing up the viability of that lore overall. And also, this is just like a huge proxy nerf to Demons of Chaos specifically, but then also monogod factions and some factions that tend to pack a lot of fizz resist, like Wood Elves. I think you're going to see like spam casters against all of those. For these items, lots of like unplayable or like unintuitive items got buffed. None of them are like massively consequential to the game as far as I can tell. Just, viability and range of options increasing, which I think is a good change. These were like well measured. For spells, the Lore of Nehekara stuff that was awful got small buffs, and Usarians got a small nerf. Usarians was still like one of the more OP direct damage spells in the game and very oppressive against Cav, but this was a measured nerf, not unreasonable. The Doombolt buffs are maybe a little bit concerning. Less so the lesser Doombolt. This was like a bound ability, but the spell Doombolt really hits very hard now. I was testing it out. So Lore of Dark, I think, is pretty strong. The Vortex change, I was talking to Catholic Alcoholic who had advocated for this. He's the guy who runs like the community balance suggestion. Before, vortexes would tend to like go in like one angular arc, and they would like lock in a direction and go that way. By increasing the randomness to true random in a 360, they'll spend more time on average in the center of the vortex cast was the idea. I tried it out and I couldn't tell, honestly. It's too fancy for me. But that's the principle. It seems like not a huge buff, but net like a small buff to vortex spells across the board. And then just like a lot of other like hard to use or like slightly below the power curve spells getting like small upgrades. The Chillwind and Doombolt both getting buffed, along with the Wood Elves Lore of Dark passive, is a lot for specifically Wood Elves because they were very strong. I think it's going to be a little bit less crazy on Dark Elves, But these two, watch out for these. I think that's actually one of the sleepers in the patch. You can just undercast this. You get the 15-second global missile buff, and then these spells are in their own right pretty playable now. So I think we'll expect to see these performing really well in a lot of contexts. Skaven, Lore of Plague, Pestilent Breath, reduced in cost. It's a fine spell. The Lore of Plague passive is pretty good, so this should open up those, excuse me, casters. I couldn't find a great application for these Kislev spells, so it doesn't look like the biggest thing. Nice to see Lore of Slaneesh get Lash on a shorter cooldown after nerf to the rest of the spells. And then the rest of these things look, kind of middle, except for Pavane, of course, which we've already covered. Swiftwing Anticity was using this already sometimes to catch, the lore that it's got on Kislev has a passive slow, and this speeds your unit up, so you can catch Skirm Cav and stuff with Kislev Cav. Adding to the charge speed makes it more intuitive. Like when it says it increases speed, it's unintuitive that it wouldn't increase speed. And charge speed, players don't think of those as different. So I think this is a nice usability buff, and it probably works now, honestly. Missile Mirror, cool to see it buffed. This is like a fun, very skill rewarding ability. You cast it on a unit, and if they shoot while it's on them, they get hit back. Gives players some opportunity to notice. Across the board, speed stuff that said speed but wasn't hitting charge speed got adjusted to do both, which is good. Flock was OP, got a small cost increase and also a cooldown time increase, which is good to see. Nice balance changes. Amber Spear wasn't playable. They did a really good job when they were taking something away, like making Laura Beast worth, upgrading the other abilities. So it was a really nice balance patch for diversity of choices. So I'm pretty excited about that. These are nice buffs, not like game changing. Shield of Thorns was already fringe viable on Lore of Life. I think we'll see Earthblood and Shield of Thorns with Lore of Life passive being really strong. If you put this on infantry or ranged units or Cav, when Cav is fighting, it does quite a bit of damage. It's really effective. Dwellers was fringe playable. It gets a meaningful buff. It's probably pretty decent now. Pendulum, small buff. People weren't overcasting it much. Maybe they will now. None of these changes are too crazy, to be honest. CA did a nice job on this. Some buffs to the vortexes that didn't work. Cool to see. So overall, pretty well-rounded patch. Really excited to try it out and play it. I think summarizing, the big highlights are, number one, the VC passive is crazy and very strong. Number two, I think the Wood Elves Lore of Dark is probably the thing that got the biggest wins here, and that helps offset the nerfs to Wood Elves. And number four, a lot of the things that were already strong are going to continue to be strong, like Tomb Kings and Ogres. But by and large, the worst and most egregious things got hit, and then we had some nice cross-cutting quality of life improvements, like elite infantry performing a bit better in the late game so you don't just get capped out, and foot characters not being randomly invincible. It feels very bad when you send your dragon after that foot sorcerer and it just won't die because you can't hit it. So that's a summary of the patch notes. Great job, CA. This is called a hot fix, but it's actually one of the most significant balance changes we've seen in a very long time. Looking forward to playing with it. Remember to like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. See y'all later, nerds.